right, we're getting started. I'm just going to let a couple of people join us before we get going, but we're very excited to have everyone here today, joining us to really dig in on some of the more complicated parts of grants, right? The budget and managing our spend. All of those things we're going to cover today. So very excited to have you all along with us today. Let's give it just one more minute and then we'll get started. So we are digging deep in today, the monitoring your burn rate. So how to monitor grant spending. This comes up again and again, and I know you all are familiar. If you're joining on this call, you are familiar with this challenge. And so we've are super excited to have our guest speaker today that's going to help us unpack this a little bit. And I know that she's also planning on having some tools for you to utilize at home or at the office. I did want to let you know we are going to have to start a little bit or stop a little bit early today, about 5 minutes, just due to other conflicting schedules. But we've got a lot of content. We are going to get into all of it, and we're going to move through it at a pace that's going to be allow us to get through the hour. I know a lot of times we have questions afterwards. We may not have time to do questions today, but I wanted to let you know two things. One, there is contact information at the end, and you can certainly reach out if you have questions that we are unable to get to today. Also, this webinar will be available on our website within a couple of days. So if you want to go back and do a little deeper dive, and I was just talking about how I do that a lot, where I go back in and there's a section I need to hear again or take notes. So feel free to do that. It will be on our website. All right, so we've got people on the call now, and we are going to get started. I know you all are familiar with the American Indigenous Tourism Association, but just real quickly, I'm super excited to have you all here today working with us. We have been doing this work as the only national organization for the last 28. We're heading into our 28th year. I'm very excited about that. We work in this very complex world of cultural tourism, the systems that are not necessarily designed to support Native nations and communities in this work, and we are working to connect that web. We serve as a unified voice for the $11.6 billion Native hospitality sector. That number comes from the U.S. Census. And if you want more information about that number, that is post-COVID number. There is more resources available on our website on that research. And I just want to end with our mission. Our mission is to define, introduce, grow, and sustain American Indigenous tourism that honors traditions and values. And again, please look for our website for any resources that that it might be helpful in your work. Also for staff information and also this webinar. So very important. And then the only destination website, a consumer-facing destination website dedicated to Indigenous tourism in the United States, was started by the American Indigenous Tourism and is also run by us, and it's destinationnativeamerica.com. It is a free resource you can utilize if you are an Indigenous tourism product. So in any ways, when you have some time, please, if you haven't already, take a look at those two resources. Okay, let's head into the start of this webinar. I didn't introduce myself before we got started, so if you don't know me, Hannah Peterson, I'm the Program Development Director here at American Indigenous Tourism Association, and I just celebrated my 10th anniversary with the American Indigenous Tourism Association, so very excited to be here today. We're very excited also to have Tonia Brown-Kinzel. She has been with us before on previous webinars, so we're very excited to have her back. She is the Grant Compliance Manager at the Grant Plan, and I'm going to hand it over to her. Thank you so much, Tonia, for joining us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys having me back. I love being here. So thank you for everybody that is going to be taking some time out today to sit with me and sit in this space to learn more about how to monitor your burn rates. And I promise I'll explain what that burn rate definition or term, the definition for that term is in just a bit. As Hannah mentioned, here is my contact information, which will be again put on the slides up at the end. You are free to contact me at any time, whether or not we're able to get to all of your questions today. If you have follow-up questions, by all means, please feel free to reach out. As Hannah mentioned, I am the grant compliance manager for the Grant Plant. The Grant Plant is a national grants consultancy firm based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we have a staff of 14 direct service team members who provide the full life cycle of grant services. So anything from helping you prospect and find your grants to writing your grants or reviewing the grants that you have written through what my role is, which is grant compliance. And that is ensuring that you're implementing your grant program in the way that you described, in the way that you promised, and in the way that you're obligated via your grant agreement. And making sure that you are monitoring and keeping track of everything going on so that hopefully, if there are any challenges, issues, roadblocks, what have you, you can then kind of stay ahead of those things to try to address them. And monitoring your burn rates is one of the most important ways of doing that. So for today's session, we are going to go over a couple of terms and definitions as promised. We will then talk about setting up your budget to actual template. Now, I am going to walk you through the process. I'm also going to show you some examples along the way. And at the end of this, when you get the notification about the recording being available, you will also get a number of handouts, not only handouts for what you're seeing on the screen, as well as a copy of my slides, but you're also going to get a couple of at-home exercises if you want to give this a try, and some other resources, including some blank templates. Furthermore, we'll talk about the importance of creating projections, not only at the outset of your grant, but while you're recording and reconciling your actual expenses, you also need to be revising your projections during your ongoing monitoring. And lastly, we will have a very brief discussion about what to do if you do run into a point where you say, oof, we do not have enough money to do this, or we're not spending nearly as much money as we thought we would. So first, to our terms and definitions. You will hear me use the term period of performance. Now, this means basically the total estimated time interval between when you start an award and when you end an award. The definition that you're seeing on the screen is from the federal uniform guidance, and so you may see terms including federal included in here, but this is true whether or not it's a federal award. It really just means when do you start and when do you stop. Now, when we think about budget periods, many of us just assume that the budget period is the same as the period of performance. But whether you have a federal grant or maybe a private sector funder, it may be the case that you are awarded a grant for up to 3 years, but that each year needs to be renewable and is a separate budget period. Sometimes you get the whole 3 years of funding right off the bat, and sometimes it's each year or each budget period is contingent upon successful completion of the last. So I just wanted to point out that there is a difference in those terms between budget period and period of performance. You're definitely going to hear me use the term budget to actual or budget to actual document or budget to actual template. And this essentially refers to a document in which you are comparing your planned and approved expenses, your approved budget, versus what you've actually spent. And that could be what you've spent as well as your program income. Now, I also encourage you to use this for projections, which we will talk about, and I'll show you some examples. But essentially, it is one of 2 key and crucial tools that I always recommend anybody who has more than, actually any grants, but more than one grant. You're going to want to keep this so that you can kind of keep track of where you're at with each grant. Now, this term is really more of a colloquialism. It's not a formal term, but you definitely hear it a lot, especially when you're talking to people who work in finance and accounting. The burn rate is basically the rate at which grant funds are being spent. So if you have a high burn rate or a fast burn rate, or sometimes people even say a hot burn rate, that means you're spending funds faster than anticipated. If you have a low burn rate or a slow burn rate, that means you're not spending funds nearly as fast as you thought you would. Now, neither a high nor a low burn rate necessarily means that there's a problem, but it does mean some conversations need to be had, some questions need to be asked, and maybe some slight tweaking or pivoting needs to happen. You may also hear the term obligation, which basically a financial obligation is where an order has been formally placed for property, services, goods, contracts, subawards, etc. It means that you have made a formal financial commitment. It doesn't mean, well, in my head, I plan to spend XYZ on ABC, but it means you have a purchase order, you have an invoice, you have a contract signed, you have some sort of formal obligation that has happened. If it is unliquidated, if the obligation is unliquidated, it means you have an obligation, but you have not yet paid. So let's take a moment to think about the grant life cycle. At the top of the circle, you'll see there's the pre-award proposal development, and this is where your budget is going to be formed. It is important to note and understand that your budget is very crucially tied into your program activities. This doesn't mean that you have to spend money on everything you're doing, but most of the time, the whole reason you're asking for a grant or extra funds is that you need those funds in order to do the activities for the grant itself. So by keeping an eye on your grant spending or your burn rate, it's a really valuable way of saying, okay, are we kind of doing the things we thought we should be doing? Most crucially, it is important to monitor the burn rate on the highlighted in yellow phases that you see towards the bottom of that circle and up towards the left-hand side. It's when you get into the post-award grant monitoring. It's definitely if and when you have a progress report due, and certainly when you have the final report due at any closeout. But you should be monitoring your burn rate well ahead of your final progress report or final report, and I would even argue well ahead of your first progress report. So now we're going to go through how you could set up your budget to actual template for ongoing monitoring. And so what I've done is I've kind of set it up step by step how you should do it. And as I mentioned, I am going to show you how I would do it. If you have a slightly different stylistic way, by all means, do what works for you. But I'm just going to give you an example of how I would do it. And then I would invite you to think about what is going to work best for your organization. The first step is that you want to set up the budget to actual template. Now, if you have a federal grant, it is actually required that you do a budget to actual template. In the Uniform Guidance to CFR 200.302B5, it says that the awardees must have a financial management system that includes, quote, a comparison of expenditures with budget amounts for each federal award. It's telling you, you have to do a budget to actual. Now, as I mentioned, if you don't have any federal grants, it may not be required, but it's definitely a best practice. And so that's why we're hosting this today. Regardless of what kind of grants you have, don't get freaked out if you see the word federal on there, because this is not just a federal requirement. It's really the best way of doing things. Because it's a best practice, we indicate and we would teach you all that grant managers should set up a budget to actual template pretty much the moment you get notification that you've got an award. Now, the budget to actual templates should be set up with whatever is your approved budget. And sometimes you're not exactly sure, especially if you're the grant manager and perhaps you did not write the grant, because I know that sometimes those are different positions. So if you're not sure where to find your budget, here are a couple of places that I would encourage you to look. Of course, in the grant award notification or in the grant agreement itself, it will usually either reference or have a copy of your original proposal, or maybe your budget is attached as an attachment. Occasionally, the budget will get tucked or nestled into your terms and conditions in that grant agreement, so don't be afraid to look there. And naturally, if you can't find it in any of those places, then I would encourage you to look in the original proposal that you submitted. And if you can't find it, worst comes to worst, ask your program officer, but you don't want to tell your program officer you don't even know what your budget is. So definitely try to look in those places first. So for today's topic, we are going to use a very brief case study, which I'm going to describe here, so that you kind of get a sense of why I might be making some of the decisions I'm making, or you can get a sense of what this budget might look like. In our case study, let's say that TGP Nonprofit has a grant to provide quarterly 3-day grant training sessions in 4 cities around the state of New Mexico. The purpose is to build federal grants management capacity for a variety of entities. TGP Nonprofit will provide ongoing technical assistance for participating entities, both themselves as well as through some contractors. And in addition, in this theoretical case study, participants would receive a laptop at the outset of the grant. And if they participate in all 4 of the trainings throughout the year, they would earn a $500 participant stipend. Now, through this grant, the TGP nonprofit is hoping to develop open grants management curriculum, some learning tools, some resources templates, much like we'll share with you after this program. And finally, it should be noted that the TGP nonprofit does have a subrecipient that they're working with. The subrecipient will produce a research and evaluation report for ongoing needs and some lessons learned. So, how do we get started? How do we create our budget to actual? I'm going to walk through the process, but I also put the instructions here for you so that you would know kind of how I came about this or how I did this. The first thing is, and I almost always do all of my budget to actuals in a spreadsheet, but you might have a particular other software that you use or format. Use whatever works for you, but I'm going to show you Excel. First things first, in a different tab, you're going to copy and paste the original approved budget to a new tab. Then, if you want to monitor this on a quarterly basis, you would insert 4 columns to the right of the original approved budget. If you were going to do this on a monthly basis, then obviously you're going to add 12. My rule of thumb is if this is a 1-year grant, I do this on a monthly basis because that happens fast. Expenditures happen. You need to stay on top of things. If it is a multi-year grant, I might do monthly or I might do quarterly. Naturally, label the top of your columns. And so for most of today, I'm just going to be using a quarterly basis for brevity and space so that these budgets, budget to actual document templates don't look super tiny on your screen. So I would label the top of the columns Q1 for quarter 1, 2, 3, and 4. Then the next step I would take is to insert 2 more columns to the right of either the quarterly columns or the monthly columns. And I would label one as remaining, meaning the remaining funds that are there, and one that is spent. Finally, I would set up the formulas in each of the columns and each of the rows to create running totals. Now, we are not going to get into how to set up formulas in Excel. If you don't know that, then I would definitely recommend look at that on YouTube or elsewhere. But if you are aware of the fact that there are formulas, you probably have some sense of just general adding, subtracting. That should be really nothing much more complicated than that. So a quick tip, if you do a federal grant, then definitely look at your SF-424A, which is the non-construction budget, or your SF-424C for construction projects, or just basically keep the budget in the same line item order as the original approved budget, whether it's a federal grant or a non-federal grant. And don't forget, I want to add, this is one tricky thing that sometimes we forget to do. If you have a grant that requires you as the awardee to provide a match, then don't forget to basically add companion columns for funder amount and your amount for each one of the periods, whether it's quarterly or whether it's monthly. So here's an example of what my budget to actual template might look like if I were doing just the quarterly monitoring of this. You can see that all of my cost categories are highlighted in black. I've got my salaries and wages, my fringe benefits, travel. Even though I have no equipment, I still have equipment listed just to basically make it well known to me that I don't have anything approved in that category. Supplies, contractual, again, I have nothing in construction, and then there's other. And then at the very bottom, not every funder allows for this, but if you are allowed to charge either indirect costs or administrative costs, you would put that at the bottom. So very quickly, if you look at the column that says budgeted, it's that second column, and you go all the way down, you can see the total amount budgeted is $300,000. Now, when you look at each of my quarterly columns, you can see that I do have subtotals in each of the cost categories, as well as subtotals down towards the bottom that will show me my various subtotals and finally the total. Right now, everything in there says 0 because I have not entered anything in. This is showing me that, okay, my formula are probably right, although I would do some testing. Now to the right, you will see that there is a remaining column as I showed you. And because I have entered nothing in there for any expenditures at all, my remaining column should equal my budgeted column. And it does. If you look at the very bottom of the remaining column, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you will see it says 300,000. And in the very last column where it says spent, naturally, it should be 0 at this point. If I have done everything correctly, then this is what it should look like. I do very quickly want to show you what a budget to actual template might look like if you have a match. But this is the only time during the training that I'm going to show you this format because I don't want it to get too confusing. But let's say we had a budget, and you will be looking over towards the left, that was 250,000 from the funder, and we had to match 50,000 for a total of 300,000. Then I would set up my budget to actual template like this, where you would see federal in gray and match in the white or unhighlighted columns. And so again, that would really help me keep track in a singular quarter of how much was being contributed by the funder and how much we were contributing. Quick note that on this budget to actual template, of which you will get a copy, not with this budget, but just a blank copy, there are actually remaining and spent columns all the way to the right. But if I included that in the screenshot, then everything would be too teeny tiny. So I didn't want to do that, but it is there, I promise. So now we're going to talk about the really important step at the very beginning of things, where you need to create your projections for how quickly and when and where do you plan on spending these funds during either each month or each quarter. And as I said, for today's case study, we're just going to operate on a quarterly basis to sort of make it easy and clean for you to see. So when we think about creating projections, it's important that after you have set up your budget to actual template, you go through and you create projections on every single line item in every single cost category for every single quarter. Even if you're putting 0 in, you want to make sure to note when and where you expect to spend funds. Rather than doing what I know I have definitely done, especially in my early years of doing grants, you don't want to just take your total budget of 300,000, for example, simply divide by 4 and say, okay, I'm going to spend 75,000 in each one of my quarters. Due to the nature of the activities, different things might be happening in different places, different times I might need to purchase things or spend things or buy contractors. So you really need to go back and look at your proposal, look at your budget narrative or budget justification, if you have one, and sort of think it through. And maybe you need to talk it through with your program staff or perhaps the person who wrote the grant, if you're different than that person. And then think, okay, rather than dividing by all 4 if it's quarterly or by 12 if it's monthly, when and where do we actually think we are going to start spending some of those things? Now, again, here's a little tip. If you do a federal grant, if this is for a federal grant, you have already had to project your expenses for at least the first and the second years, if it's a multi-year. So look at your SF 424A Section D, and that will give you at least a guideline for things. So now we have our next walkthrough. And as I mentioned, and as Hannah mentioned, you'll get a couple of at-home exercises or at-office exercises that you can do after this. But I really just wanted to kind of to walk you through how I would do or how I do these things on a daily basis. So first things first, I'm going to read the budget narrative and the proposal to basically make decisions about how much to project out for each of the actual columns in quarters 1, 2, 3, and 4. My recommendation to you is that you put all financial projections in blue and in italics. And the reason for this is because most of the time the default color is black. And if you have a negative number in Excel, it will automatically default to the negative number being in red. So we don't want to use either black or red because then we might not know off the top of our heads, oh, this is not actually an actual expense. It's just a projected expense. So whether you use blue or green or purple or what have you, use what you want. But I find that blue tends to work really well. So any projections on my sheet or anytime I look at a budget to actual, if I see blue italics, I know that's only a projection. It's not the actual expenses. Finally, and this is completely optional and stylistic to you, feel free to put notes with any decision calculus as to why you made certain projections on the far right of each line item. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these slides, but I'm going to go through just a few of them so you can kind of see. For example, let's say you talk to your staff, you read your budget narrative, and for the most part, your staff are going to be fairly evenly working on this throughout the year. That is a time where it would be appropriate to take the total budgeted, divide it by 4, and throw it into those 4 quarterly columns. So you'll see both under salaries, I have $100,000 for a training director, so I would put $25,000 in each quarter. Similarly, I have 18,000 for fringe benefits for the training director. I would divide that by 4 and put 4,500 in each quarter. It is okay at times for certain things, as long as you don't expect one quarter to be more budget heavy or there's a reason why somebody would need to work more. On the other hand, if I knew the training director, or maybe it'd be a better example of the grant manager, since the training director is 100%, maybe the grant manager would have to do a whole bunch of work at the beginning, or maybe a whole bunch of work at the end, and then my numbers would be different, my projections. For travel, I would just simply estimate it based on the maximum amount of each quarter for each rate. So in this case, lodging in Santa Fe is $162 times 3 nights, which is $486. And then you see the times 4 on that line because it's 4 quarters. So I would basically estimate the max again across all 4 quarters. Another example of when it does, in fact, end up being something that you divide by 4. But here's an example of when you can't just divide by 4. Let's say at the beginning of this, you know you need to buy 20 laptops, and you know you're going to have the distribution happen for all of the participants in the first quarter. So I can't buy these laptops throughout the course of things. I'm going to buy them all right up front. Not only that, I have an incentive to buy them all in one time in one place because the vendor is offering us a discount. So if I have $20,000 budgeted for laptops, I'm going to put that full $20,000 in Q1. Now, again, just like the staff, we're expecting some of the one-on-one technical assistance and coaching services to be pretty even throughout the year. We divide that evenly across all 4 quarters. But then here's where it gets a little different, and this is why it's important to have these conversations and to do these projections. Let's say that we are working with our subrecipient who's doing our evaluation and research report, as we previously discussed, and they told us they felt they were going to have to do a substantial amount of work in the first 2 quarters. They've got to set up the evaluation framework. They've got to develop their data collection instruments. They got to create all their various tools. And so they said of the $72,162 that is budgeted for them across the entire year, they believe they'll probably use about $50,000 in just the first 2 quarters. So I would take that $50,000, divide it by 2, and put $25,000 in quarter 1 and $25,000 in quarter 2. Then I would take the remaining. If I took $72,162, I subtracted off $50,000. That leaves me with $22,162, which when we divide it by 2 gives us $11,081, which I would evenly distribute against the last 2 quarters because they said it's pretty much going to be even at that point. On the other hand, as you know in our case study, the participants who are eligible for a stipend would not actually be eligible for the stipend until the very end once they have attended that 4th training in the 4th quarter. So while I have $10,000 that is budgeted for that line item, I'm not going to spend $2,500 a quarter, right? I'm only going to spend up to $10,000 in that final quarter. So once you put it all together and you're plugging this in to your budget to actual, you would have something that looks like this. Now, I want you to note at the very bottom in the middle, remember, if we were to just have taken 300,000 and divided it into 4, the number would have been 75,000 across all 4 quarters. But as you can see in the first quarter, we actually think we're going to be spending about 98,000. In that second quarter, we're right around 75,000. In the third quarter, we're down to 57,000, but in the fourth quarter, we're back up to 67,000. So this is why it's important to not just plug in numbers and go like, there is a divide by 4 and that's what it's going to be. This will give you a realistic idea of what the pace of spending should be for your organization if everything goes as planned. And that's the crucial part. So now let's talk about reconciling actual expenditures, or in other words, looking at your general ledger, making sure everything on there is appropriate to your grant, and then plugging the actual numbers into the budget itself. So the next step is to update the template with actuals. I always recommend that within the first 2 months of your grant's launch, that you should be regularly reviewing your general ledger or your fund audit account or whatever report or tool you use to monitor your expenditures. And the reason I say the first 2 months is I do recognize that sometimes for some organizations, they won't even reconcile their expenditures until, halfway through the next month. So usually by the end of the second month, you have at least 1 month's worth of expenditures. Once that general ledger or journal account or fund audit report has been reviewed and approved by you, your accountant, whoever else needs to be there, you then need to take those numbers and update your budget to actual with actual expenses. I also recommend that once you get to the last 2 to 3 months of your grants period of performance, you should start reviewing your general ledger at least bi-weekly, even if a full monthly fully, reconciled general ledger is not available, because this allows you to identify any potential issues in spending down the full amount of the grant by the termination date. So here's what I would do. I would review my general ledger or my fund audit report or journal, whatever you call it, and associate which line items correspond with which cost categories, and then insert those into the budget to actual document. Now, this happens much more frequently than we'd like to think, but a lot of times there are surprise unbudgeted line items that may be still very appropriate to your grant and would be an allowable expense, but you just didn't anticipate it. In that case, then you need to edit or modify your budget to actual template to add that line item or line items, but then under the budget column, you're going to put 0. And I'll show you an example in a moment. Finally, transfer those numbers that you've calculated to the budget to actual document, and of course, make sure your totals add up. So here's an example. This is the summary, right? It shows all the cost categories. You will see there are 3 columns. There is a debit column, meaning the original amount that was output. There is a credit column because there was a rebate that was offered, and there was an adjustment that had to happen under travel. And then there's the final balance. So really, I want to focus on that 3rd column when I'm looking at what gets transferred to the budget to actual document. In the end, my budget to actual document should show $86,640.69. So if I go to my budget to actual document, you will see here that I've got all those things. So under salaries and wages, that total, and I hid the other columns again, just to make this easy to look at. That column has $30,296.70. If I go back to this summary, it matches $30,296.70. Okay, good. That's what I want to see. Then under fringe benefits, I see a total of $5,448.06. I go back to my summary. I go back to my general ledger. Okay, good. We're in the right zone. When we look at the amount of actual travel that happened in the first quarter, we're looking at $2,624.67. Great. That matches my line 4 totals for travel. We don't have any equipment expenses, which was what we expected. And we did purchase all of our computers in the first quarter. So the total expenses after the credit was applied was $19,265.40, which matches what I'm seeing on that line 6 on the far right. Don't confuse the far left, which was the original output, if there is some kind of credit or adjustment that had to happen. Under contractual, we had $3,000 in expenses. That matches my summary. And then for other program expenses, I see $15,912. So let's go back to my budget and actual to see if it matches. And it does, $15,912. But the other thing I want you to note here, which is new, is line 33. It's the first line under the black line that says other. Here you will see that we decided to add grant management software subscription to our program expenses because we felt that it aligned with the cost objectives, it aligned with the goals of the grant. We talked to our program officer. They agreed this is a great way to spend some of the monies. So under the budgeted column, which is the first column, you'll see there's a 0 there. And then you'll see under Q1, we spent $4,662. But what that's going to do to me is under the remaining category, it is going to show negative $4,662 because we didn't budget for it. And of course, it'll show spent $4,662. This is not a cause for panic or concern, but what it is an indicator that somewhere else we have to spend $4,662 less than what we had originally anticipated. And it doesn't necessarily have to come from just one place. It could come from multiple places sort of spread out amongst all of them. But I do need to be mindful as somebody monitoring this budget and monitoring these expenses that we've got to cut back from somewhere in order to have added that expense. So this is where the rubber really hits the road. And this is where it is really important to have some of these conversations. You should be regularly hosting stakeholder meetings, meaning your finance person is there, your program manager, your day-to-day grant manager is there, day-to-day program volunteer is there, whoever is executing that grant should be in regular meetings in which you're going over expenditures. Now, quick note, if you have salaries and fringe benefits in there, you might have to redact those or somehow be careful how you can share that sensitive information. Don't make the mistake of just sending out everybody's salary to everybody else. That has definitely happened. I've seen it happen. I think I have never made that mistake, but I can't say I've never done it in my younger years. I've certainly tried to be very, very conscientious about it. Other than salaries and fringe, rarely is something super sensitive, but just make sure before you share it out, maybe you talk with your supervisor, executive director to make sure they're comfortable with everything being shared. So when you meet with your supervisors, your program staff, your finance staff, and board members, if that's a thing you do, which I don't always recommend that because sometimes that lends to some micromanagement, but occasionally it's relevant. And you bring in any other stakeholders or partners, you're going to then use your budget to actual document to guide discussion on how the grant project is going. Now, if you remember, we talked about what a burn rate is and what they mean. And so if a burn rate is faster or higher than expected, meaning you are spending more than you projected in those blue italics, then you need to start asking questions about why that is. You need to see what, if anything, can be done to adjust activities to bring spending in line with what was budgeted. This is also a time where sometimes you will discover people are putting the wrong things on grants. They're applying expenditures that aren't actually relevant to your grant and should be on another grant or elsewhere. And sometimes, and Hannah and I were talking about this right before the training, sometimes there is a disconnect between your grant activities and what those should be and your grant expenses. And so these meetings are really a crucial time to be facilitating some of those conversations and finding out, why are we spending faster than we thought we would? Maybe the answer is, oh, we had a lot of demands for technical assistance right out the gate in quarter 1. And so we spent a lot more there. Or, ooh, we didn't really think about the fact that when we were setting up this, the grant manager would have to spend a lot more time in that first quarter. And so the first quarter was very fast or very high or very hot, right? That, again, is not necessarily going to invoke panic in me, but it's something I need to be mindful of as the person who is monitoring this, to not only say, okay, that was appropriate to bill to this grant, but also to be saying, okay, now we need to be mindful that in the end, we have to dial back some of the time because we spent more time than anticipated in the first quarter or the second quarter, for example. Now, on the other hand, if you are like, oof, we are going to need all that money and we are burning through this way faster than we thought, then this is going to be a time where you're going to have to say, hey, we need to fundraise elsewhere. We need to figure out where we're going to get more money. We need to communicate to the funder that this is going way faster. Maybe the funder will provide extra money. That's rare, but it has happened. Or maybe the funder will say, no, you need to dial it back and scale back services so that you can simply just stay within budget. On the other hand, and this is what I actually find tends to happen more often than overspending, if your grant project's burn rate is slower than expected, meaning you're spending less than you thought or you intended or you expected, then you really need to be asking questions about why that is. You need to ask whether all anticipated activities have been implemented or executed, or whether all planned purchases have been made. Maybe you did buy the computers in the first quarter, but they didn't actually get billed or the thing didn't get processed until the second quarter. That could be an easy answer. Or maybe you had technical assistance, coaching, and other offer hours that were available, but one of your contractors was on vacation during one of the months, and so it was much slower, but they're planning on really bringing this up to speed in the next quarter, right? There could be and I'm sure there often are, very legitimate reasons about why certain things aren't happening. But this could also be a time when they say, we're really struggling getting this program up and running. Like, we can't get the staff on board. We can't get vendors to come in with us. We can't find the right sites to do this. We thought we would be able to hit the ground running with this, and we are just struggling getting going. Now, if you're hearing that in the first few months of the grant, again, I would be concerned. I would be mindful. I would be as proactive as possible. But if you're still hearing this several months into the grant, especially if it's a 1-year grant, that may be something that, again, is a cue to you that you need to go back to your program officer and you need to say, hey, we're really struggling. Can we have some extra time? Or do you have any resources that can help us with this? This is an opportunity for you to basically course correct and or create a corrective action plan to get back on track. If all plan activities and expenditures have simply been made and you're just spending less than you thought you would, then you will start to have a conversation and start thinking about, as the year or the budget period goes on, how you might rebudget those excess funds if that pace holds. And that's a great place to be in, as long as you can rebudget it to other stuff. Now, once you have plugged in some of those actuals and you've begun to have some of these conversations about how's it going, where are we at, where are we spending more, and where are we spending less, you want to begin populating your budget to actual document with both the actual expenditures and revenue, if applicable, to monitor that burn rate. But you also want to make sure that you are adding projections, because the projections throughout the course of the grant will help you figure out, ooh, are we going to end up way over? Are we going to end up way under? What is our pace? And if there are major variances between your initial budget and your projections, then again, you can start making adjustments. So let's see what that might look like. Let's say you start by looking at your budget to actual sheet. You review the subtotals of your actual expenditures and the amount that is remaining on your budget to actual document. Then gather more information about what is expected in the coming months or quarters through your regular monitoring meetings. And with that information, then you need to go back and start revising your projections. Whoop. But don't forget that your revised projections need to be in blue italics or whatever color and format you use. And of course, you want to ensure that those totals do not exceed that full amount of the award. So here's an example of what it might look like if I am halfway through my budget period. I have 2 quarters in that are actual expenses, and I'm at the very middle of the year, and I'm thinking, okay, what can we expect in quarter 3, and what can we expect in quarter 4? We'll go over some examples about how I might have come up with those projections, but what you want to be looking at when you're looking at this sheet is you see, oh, okay, the grant manager on line 5 shows a negative remaining balance of $1,059.32. And I have a total of negative $1,444.45 under fringe benefits. That means I'm spending roughly $2,500 more than I had budgeted. So I need to look to see if I can come up with that money elsewhere. We'll also see that I had some overage in travel for some reasons that'll be explained shortly at almost $600. But I did save over $700 with my laptop. So that kind of balances at least that one cost category out. Now, when we go all the way down to the other section, and I'm looking at the second from the right column, under Grant Management Software Subscription, line 34, remember we added that, so it is negative $4,662. But the nice thing is, I didn't end up spending nearly as much as I thought I would, especially in the first 2 quarters on the subrecipient. And so we actually have $10,762 projected to be left over at the end of this budget period. So if I look all the way at the very last line, as it stands right now, when I combine my projections with the actual expenses, we're looking at us having maybe just under $3,000 left over in this grant at the end of the budget period. Now, on a $300,000 award, that's kind of a sweet spot to be, right? You don't want to be way over or way under. I would not necessarily at this point immediately start reassigning those funds. I'd probably wait until a little later in the year. But right now I'm going, okay, good. We're going to come in and right around 297,000. We might have about 3,000 left over. As we get closer to the end of the budget period, we'll decide if and where we can spend those extra dollars, or we might find that quarter 3 goes a little higher than expected. Of course, don't forget to submit your quarterly, semi-annual, and annual progress reports as they are required from your funders. And I will tell you, monitoring your burn rates And having updated budget to actual document all times is going to be so incredibly helpful to immediately be able to fill out some of those financial reports. And anytime your program officer might check in on you, it's also very important to know as well. So here are some ways to troubleshoot challenges if, despite your best efforts and your best laid plans, you really are struggling with getting some of these things to go the way you had hoped, right? And it happens to the best of us. So the first thing is, if there is a dramatic difference between what was budgeted and what your actual expenditures are, whether more or less, you need to contact your program officer immediately. Advise them of your progress and any budgetary shortfalls, or if you're spending too much in a particular cost category or line item. This is really going to help you in kind of defining what might help correct this situation. Now, if necessary, after having a conversation with your program officer, you both decide, okay, we need to do a budget modification. Like we need to take a big chunk of money from this section and put it over here in this section. Then here is some sample language. Now, I want to warn you, this language is very formal and does actually cite the federal law that allows you to request a federal budget modification. If what you're doing is not for a federal grant, then obviously you can take out that federal language, but most of the rest of this is still going to apply to you. So, for example, you might say, on behalf of TGP nonprofit and per 2 CFR 200.308B, we would like to request prior approval for a budget revision to our grant, building grant management capacity in New Mexico. And then I would insert the award number. FAIN is the federal ID number. And I would say it's from the U.S. U.S. Agency of Awesome, Department of Cool grant programs. Please find the attached budget and or budget narrative, if you do that, in the same format used in the original or approved application. This articulates the proposed new budget for the period of performance beginning on whatever date you want it to start on and ending on whatever the end of that budget period is. Then I would do a very quick summary justifying what is happening and why you're asking for this change. And then there's some legalese at the end of that if it's a federal grant. If it's not a federal grant, you can probably ditch that stuff. So my tip to you, if you need to do a federal budget modification, is demonstrate that any newly requested costs relate to the program goals or the objectives. And again, this is true whether or not you are doing a federal or a non-federal grant. Demonstrate the new expenditures are reasonable and allowable for the grant, and start early. This is why the budget to actual document or the tool is so incredibly valuable, because you do not want to get caught when the progress report is due, or worse, when the grant is over and go, oh my gosh, we didn't spend $23,000. And I see this happen all the time, which is why we created this training, because we don't want to see this happen for anybody. Now, it may also be the case that you need more time in order to implement your program or to spend all the funds. And so if you are in that situation, it is possible you could request an extension. This is true of both federal and non-federal, although federal does have some specific rules. So let's talk about those rules in a moment. For federal grants, you can request what's called a no-cost extension for up to 12 months, and these requests should be received at least 10 days before the grant is set to expire. For non-federal grants, you want to make these requests at least as soon as possible, but generally, once the grant has expired, the answer is going to be no. I've only seen a non-federal funder say yes one time after the grant was over, and it was a very exceptional circumstance in which it was really not the organization's fault. There was something that happened kind of very much at the last second. So again, this is framed as if you have a federal grant. Strip out the language that doesn't apply if you want to use it for a non-federal grant. But here's some sample language. And this language obviously is going to be on the slides that you get a copy of. But I also want to note that there are separate documents or handouts that you will get that have the sample language. So you might say something like, on behalf of TGP nonprofit and per 2 CFR 308 F10, we would like to request a one-time no-cost extension for the period of performance to complete our grant. I'd insert all the details, the name of the grant, the award, the agency or department giving it to us, and basically say we are looking for X amount of months, maybe 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. The scope of our work is to do federal grant management capacity building through trainings, technical assistance, and a cohort. And while we anticipate completing most of our activities within the existing period of performance, there are a small but meaningful amount of additional work that includes, and then I would list out what it is we still want to do with our no-cost extension. And then here are some more, this is a legal ease for federal stuff. In order to, and then you summarize the justification, we request 12 months to complete the work. The terms and conditions don't prohibit this, blah, 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 blah. We won't get into the legalese. Don't forget that you need to obligate all of your funds before the period of performance termination date. This is true whether it's federal or not. You basically have to commit those funds. And sometimes there's a couple of days or months, depending on the funder, for which you can liquidate those obligations, but you have to commit those funds before your grant is over. Once obligated, ensure that those obligations are in fact liquidated before your final report is submitted to the funder. Now, if you are doing a federal grant, you have 90 days to liquidate your obligations, and your final report is due at 120 days after the period of, or the termination of your period of performance. For non-federal grants, you need to see your grant agreement or your grant letter because those report deadlines and liquidation deadlines may be different. It's going to vary by each funder. Quick note to make sure you establish a consistent protocol for organizing your grant management system and your grant management files. Make sure that all of your files, including every version of your budget to actual document, is stored electronically in at least 2 places. So maybe your computer and a cloud, or your computer and a file cabinet. And whenever possible, print at least the hard copies of the really crucial stuff. I'm not going to encourage you to print everything that's really wasteful, but at least make sure to print things that if if your computer gets wiped out, you've got it somewhere, right? And also, really important, ensure that more than one person can access these files, because if somebody quits, you want to be able to access them. Make sure your organization has a policy for how long documents should be retained. Now, lastly, we have about 3 to 4 minutes for questions, but I just want to let you know these are all the handouts and resources you'll be getting after this session. They'll be emailed to you at some point, and you are free to contact me if you have any questions. I'm going to put my contact information up there one last time for you all, and then I'm going to invite 1 or 2 questions if you've got it, and I know we've got to log off about 5 minutes early, right at 55 past the hour, so look to see if there's anything in the chat. Y'all have been very quiet today. I have just got out of another training where the people are asking lots of questions, and it's wonderful to get the questions. So does anybody have any questions or comments or concerns or stories they want to share? We'll give another couple of seconds. You're free to, I don't know, can I see them raise their hand? We're in the participant of the webinar. Thank you, Penny. I appreciate it.
Just one question. When you were
Sure.
going through the when you were shifting expenses, there are rules around how much you can move from category to category depending on who
Great
you're
question.
working with. And
Yes.
I just wanted you to do just a little bit of information about that so that there isn't the assumption, oh, I can just move it. So
Yeah.
if you can
Yeah.
talk to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer first on the federal side, which is the standing rule of thumb, unless it's explicitly stated otherwise in your grant agreement, is that you have the luxury of moving 10% of your overall budget between approved cost categories. So if you remember, I didn't have anything approved under equipment and I didn't have anything approved under construction. So I couldn't suddenly just move it into that category. But I could move 10% between salaries and fringe benefit and travel and other because those were approved. That is the federal answer. On the non-federal side, it is very dependent on the funder. Some funders say, we don't care, you get the money, spend it on the program, and they don't really care kind of how you do it. Others will say, you must ask for even a penny difference that you might spend in a different cost category. So you really need to confer with the grant agreement and the terms and conditions there.
Thank you for that. It is a complicated one, right? So I just wanted to make sure that we covered that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you.
I am so excited we had the opportunity to do this grant today, our grant grant burn rate webinar today, because this is something that I work a lot in, and I know it is a question that people have struggles with, right? So it's great that we have the template, and there's some additional things coming your way. I did want to end with gratitude. Thank you so much for doing this with us, for taking the time and breaking it down for us, and for the tools that you will be receiving afterwards, everyone participating. I also wanted to let everyone on the call or on the webinar know, if you haven't already, there are some amazing resources on our website that you are available for download. We work very hard to make sure that we are serving our constituency, and this is your opportunity to check into any of those. We also have our staff listed there. So if there are things that you are interested in learning more about, please reach out to us. We want to help if we are able. And then I know we have a crazy tight schedule today, so I'm going to let everyone get 5 minutes back from the hour. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And of course, thank you to our speaker.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone.
Take care.